Stop, thief! Stop, thief! There is a passion for hunting something deeply implanted in the human breast. This is an astonishing statement, and it follows on the event that you see in George Cruikshank's wonderful illustration above. Oliver has found a way of working with Fagin's gang and is taken out for the first time by Charlie and the Dodger to a street near Cleveland Street and sees this elderly fellow with his swallowtail coat reading a book at a bookstall. And all of a sudden they reach into the man's pocket and takes out his pocket handkerchief. Pocket handkerchiefs were rather expensive articles of clothing. They usually had an initial sewed into them, and back in the thieves' den you would pick those initials out. And of course what we're talking about there is you are taking away the identity, the proof of the identity, the connection of the identity to the owner of the pocket handkerchief. So the pocket handkerchief's a little bit like a piece of paper that has been stamped with an identity and then erased or washed away. In any case, they get the pocket handkerchief. Mr. Brownlow, who is the gentleman who was reading, turns around, thinks it's Oliver who was stealing, yells, "Stop thief, stop thief," and Charlie and the Dodger take up the call and start chasing after Oliver as if Oliver were the thief. And pretty soon the whole community is out, following them along and trying to capture Oliver. There is a passion for hunting something. Oliver becomes dehumanized, and that passion simply for running and catching something ends up motivating the entire crowd. So you begin to wonder just exactly who's good and who's bad here. Mr. Brownlow discovers to his embarrassment that in thinking Oliver is the thief and running after him, he's kept the book he was reading in his hand and is another thief. So is it the hunting something that in this particular episode is stigmatized more than the act of thievery, since the good man, Mr. Brownlow, commits the theft as much as the bad boys do, and Oliver's identified to the thief, but he did nothing. It is the custom on the stage in all good murderous melodramas to present the tragic and the comic scenes in as regular alternation as the layers of red and white on a side of streaky, well-cured bacon. This is the narrator's voice at the beginning of a chapter of Oliver Twist, explaining why the book varies between the good world and the bad world. Oliver Twist has often been called a Manichaean novel, in which there's a good world on one side and a bad world on the other. And in fact, Dickens's map of London serves us well here, because if you start at the Angel in Islington, as Oliver does coming into town, if he goes east, which would be like this, if he goes east, he goes into the criminal world. If he goes west, he goes into Mr. Brownlow's world and eventually Chertsey and the Maylies and all the good stuff. So the Angel, interestingly enough, another little symbolic point that Dickens didn't have to introduce or make up, was really a kind of dividing line between two parts of the city. And so the narrator is going to explain the technique here of bad world and good world and streaky baking and tragic and comedy. Well, over on the other wall, we saw Oliver trying to break into the Maylies' house. Here he is after he has been captured the first time by Mr. Brownlow. This is before the Maylie episode over there. And because he's fallen by the side of the road and been rescued by Mr. Brownlow and taken to Mr. Brownlow's home and is recovering. And so the immediately preceding moment was the sort of stop thief moment like this one. And now Oliver is secure in a middle-class home, very respectable. This is a point at which I think one wants to introduce another important theme about the novel. The parish seal, which raised Oliver, it's imprinted in the buttons of Mr. Bumble's jacket when Mr. Bumble is putting Oliver up for sale, is the Good Samaritan. Everyone is your neighbor. The world is your neighbor. Your responsibility begins next door with your neighbor. That's the notion of the Good Samaritan. Well, that's clearly not the way the 1834 New Poor Law thought about neighbors. They thought about them as, if they were impoverished, as drains on the pocket of the rich. So the whole theme of the Good Samaritan is very ironically enacted in this novel. Oliver is cared for by a parish that takes as its emblem the Good Samaritan, but he's thrown to the side of the road whenever he can be thrown. When he finally runs away from the undertakers, he's rescued by a thief. Wait a minute, isn't the Good Samaritan beset by thieves, not rescued by one? But Dickens just switches the whole story around. And then Mr. Brownlow is the second Good Samaritan and rescues Oliver again. So there becomes a very complicated moment in this story when it isn't clear what the Good Samaritan stands for. But up in the corner, over the mantelpiece, hard to see in this particular image, is Cruikshank's clear drawing of the very classic image of the Good Samaritan. There you can see a palm tree and the man just leaning over the man who's lying on the ground. So Mr. Brownlow's housekeeper's sitting room has an image of the Good Samaritan in it and suggests that maybe this time around Oliver has actually fallen into the proper kind of caring and the proper Good Samaritan. The other part of this image, which is very, very important, is the figure in the portrait immediately behind Oliver. Oliver's chair used to be on this side of the fireplace, and he would look at the picture of that lady and be so disturbed by it that they decided to switch the furniture around to calm him down. They still don't know who he is. This is Mr. Brownlow and his housekeeper, Mrs. Bedwin. But it turns out that that is the portrait of Oliver's mother, painted by Oliver's father, who was Mr. Brownlow's best friend. Now, these kinds of coincidences happen in Dickens, but they happen in life as well. And so the rescue theme that is part of this image, which follows immediately after Oliver and Stop Thief and the passion for hunting something, is a wonderful example of the streaky Bacon style. That's all tragedy and fear and violence and hunting something and dehumanizing. This is all middle-class mercy and rescue. And there are those who say, I'd much rather be in Fagin's gang than in this room full of elderly people and dead portraits. I sold myself, said Mr. Bumble, pursuing the same strain of reflection, for 6 teaspoons, a pair of sugar tongs, and a milk pot, with a small quantity of second-hand furniture and 20 pounds in money. I went very reasonable, cheap, dirt cheap. This is another example of the kind of streaky Bacon plotting of Oliver Twist and of melodrama and popular theater in general, and indeed it's in Shakespeare and the late romances and in lots of other plays as well. Mr. Bumble was of course, the beadle of the parish, and he went to tea with the matron of the workhouse one day and took an inventory of her portable property while she was out making the tea and decided that, the sugar tongs, the teaspoons, the milk pot, 20 pounds, secondhand furniture, he could marry her, have live-in accommodations instead of having to live outside the workhouse, be in charge of the whole shebang. And so he marries her. That scene of Mr. Bumble's courtship takes place in the novel, in between the moment when Oliver is shot in the wash house and any information about Oliver's fate, which it took the readers of the magazine where this story was running 2 months to discover. So there's this comic interlude with Bumble proposing to Mrs. Corney and getting married. And there's a sequel to that, which I'll get to in a minute. But meanwhile, this scene in itself is so funny that it was excerpted and acted and performed all over the place. And the poster that we have for this particular image is not the wonderful Cruikshank illustration of Bumble and Mrs. Corney kind of scooting around the table, getting close to each other and closer to the fire, but it's Bumble's courtship in an acting edition and all the places where it was sold, which tells you something about the popularity of Dickens. It's not only sold in Aberdeen and Bath and Liverpool and Manchester and Newcastle and Plymouth, in Bombay, Calcutta, Madras, Simla, Canada, Cape of Good Hope, Melbourne, Adelaide, New Zealand, and Sydney. All booksellers in England and the colonies, no U.S. or Canada, but no other U.S. North American place. So the scenes from Dickens could be excerpted themselves and turned into little dramatic moments or a whole one-act dramatic play. And Mr. Bumble and Mrs. Corney is one of the great acting scenes even to this day. It turns out in the end that Mrs. Corney actually rules the roost. And Bumble loses his Beatles uniform because he's only married to the matron now. Somebody else is the Beatle. And he is put down in every possible way. Mrs. Corney, on the other hand, goes out and discovers the tokens of Oliver's identity and tries to get rid of them at profit to herself, but is discovered. And so there's an inquiry at the end of the novel where Mrs. Corney and Mr. Bumble are interviewed by Mr. Brownlow, and Mr. Brownlow says to Bumble, well, you should have assumed, and the law assumes, that you are in charge of your wife, that your wife acts under your directions. So this theft must have been something, that you approved of or supervised, because the law assumes that you were in charge. And Bumble makes one of the great famous statements of Dickens's career. He says, if the law assumes that, the law is a ass, a idiot.